How do you do, boys and girls? My name is Alfred Hitchcock, and I'm delighted to find that you believe in ghosts too. After all, they believe in you, so it is only common courtesy and politeness to return the favor. As a matter of fact, I tell them human stories all the time, and they enjoy them immensely. Now, of course, the best way to listen to ghost stories is with the lights out. There is nothing like a dark room to attract ghosts, and you may like to have some of our mutual friends come and listen with you. Are the lights out? Good. Doors closed and blinds drawn? Excellent. Don't worry about the ghosts getting in. They can slither through keyholes and under doors, you know. Now just be quiet. Hear that slithering? Ah, good. Now that we're all here, we can begin. First of all, let me say that I have always been curious about those things which makes the average person's blood run cold with fear and horror. But then the average person becomes upset over such simple things as a door opening, footsteps in the hall, an ordinary owl or cat. And they make such a fuss over simple things like the fluttering of a bird's wings, a girl's voice on a summer evening, or for that matter, a dripping faucet, as we seem to have here. But you and I are above these things. However, it might be best for me to get a wrench and turn that water off completely. While I'm doing that, why don't you listen to the first story, The Haunted and the Haunters, or The Pirate's Curse. It's about the housing shortage some years ago.
I had just arrived back in London with my family from a trip to India. It was the spring of 1894, as I recall, and the first job at hand was to find quarters for ourselves and our servant, a nice, agreeable chap named Alfred. After several days of touring the busy streets of London, I finally found a house that was unoccupied. Taking down the address of the owner, I went around to see him. He was delighted to see me, much too delighted, in fact. He said he would let me use the house rent-free for an entire year if I could move in immediately. Poor fellow had the idea the place was haunted. For my part, I was delighted and made plans to stay there that very night. I was pleased to find that Alfred was willing to join me in the little adventure. I sent him on ahead and ran around to our hotel to notify my wife of our good fortune and tell her I was spending the night in our new house. I reached the house, knocked, and my servant Alfred opened the door. He lit a candle, and we went to the rooms we were to occupy for the night. My bedroom was the largest. The four-poster bed was opposite the fireplace, and Alfred soon had a fire burning bright and clear. A door communicated with the small room that Alfred was to occupy, which had no other exit but that door leading to my bedroom. In the bureau, which rested near the bed, I found an old silk kerchief, a few odds and ends of female dress, and two faded letters tied round with a narrow ribbon of pale yellow. While I read them, Alfred opened a small box and removed a revolver and a dagger which I had ordered him to bring. One could never tell. Each letter consisted of one line. The first stated, "What's done can't be undone," and the second, "There's nothing against you unless the dead could come to life." In a shaky female hand had been written, "They can." It was then that I noticed on the outside envelope the words, "Lost at sea." I laid the letters on a table in the center of the room, stirred up the crackling fire, picked up a volume of Dickens, and read quietly enough until about 11:30. I told Alfred he might retire to his room. A few moments before midnight, I felt a sudden draught of cold air pass by my cheek. I fancied the door to my right had got open, but no, it was closed. I then looked to the left and saw the flame of the candles flicker violently. I sprang up and seized the revolver and the dagger. Then I heard 3 slow, loud, distinct knocks at the head of my bed. Suddenly, Alfred ran from his room. If ever I saw horror in the human face, it was then. He gasped in a hollow whisper that scarcely seemed to come from his lips. "Run, run, it is after me." He ran to the landing and down the stairs, taking several at a time. In a moment I heard the street door open and slam shut. I was alone in the haunted house. Then I saw it. How shall I tell you what it was like? It was a darkness, shaping itself forth from the air in very undefined outline. I cannot say it was of human form, and yet it had more resemblance to a human form than anything else. As it stood, its dimensions seemed gigantic, the summit nearly reaching the ceiling. As I stared, I thought that I distinguished 2 eyes looking down on me from the boiling air. I tried to speak, but could not. I could only think to myself, is this fear? Is this fear? I tried to move, but could not. I felt as if I were weighted down by an irresistible force. Opposed to my will was another, far superior. My fear now became horror, horror that no words can convey. Still, I retained pride. And if not pride, then courage. For in my mind I said, this is horror, but it is not fear. Unless I fear, I cannot be harmed. With a great deal of effort, I reached my hand out toward the dagger on the table. But as I did, I felt a strange shock on my arm and shoulder, and I was powerless. And now the light slowly began to wane from the candles. The same was happening with the fire. In a moment, the room was in utter darkness, and my terror reached a climax. And wonder of wonders, I broke forth with the words, "I do not fear, my soul does not fear." With that, I found the strength to leap from the bed and rush to the window and throw back the curtains and fling open the shutters, for my first thought was, light! As the bright moonlight flooded into the room, I felt a joy that almost compensated for the previous terror. Then came the same measured knocks I had heard before. The entire room began to vibrate. A chair advanced itself from the far wall to the table, and in it there now grew a shape. It was that of a young woman with long blonde hair which she was combing. And as she combed, she looked at the door to the landing as if waiting. The shadow on the far wall seemed to grow darker and darker. It also seemed to be waiting. Now from that door appeared another shape, that of a young man in the dress of a century ago. He moved toward the young woman, and as he did, the great shadow struck, boiling down over the two. There was a soft chuckling sound. Then the great shadow whirled away as if in triumph, and there on the floor it left the wispy figures of the young man and woman. As it had been withdrawn, the flame grew in the candles and the fire in the grate. The whole room came once more calmly into sight. The next day I explained the night's proceedings to the owner, and together we went over the house with a fine tooth comb. In the basement we found buried back under the bedroom wing a battered sea chest with a crest on it bearing the letters G.H., and in it a sheaf of papers which explained the ritual of the night before. G.H. were the initials of Gideon Hawke, an English pirate who had been in love with the young girl who lived in this home 100 years ago. She refused his attentions and married a proper gentleman of aristocratic birth. In a rage of vengeance, Hawke vowed their death. But before he could arrive in England on his terrible mission, his boat was caught in a storm, and nothing survived but the wreckage in which was found the trunk. A short time later, the young lady and her husband died under very mysterious circumstances. With the removal of the trunk, the nightly reenactment of Gideon Hawk's revenge ceased, and I must say that the house has become a fine, cozy home for myself and my family. As a matter of fact, we still live there.
As you can tell, I didn't manage to find a wrench, but I did find a pail, which is just as well as the drain pipe is quite clogged and rusty. Whilst I consider the next step in my plumbing problem, you can listen to another innocent story, The Magician, or Till Death Do Us Part.
It was hard to imagine why Jenny thought the magician in the circus attractive. He had large, bulging eyes, a high-domed forehead, and a thin slit of a mouth which twitched slightly all the time. But, dressed in his top hat and wearing a red silk lined cape, he was everything a poor romantic little farm girl could ask for, especially a little farm girl whose life was one dreary day of drudgery after another. Perhaps it was the strange, hypnotic feeling she had when he said, "Jenny, eh? What a pretty name. What a pretty girl. And you say you would like a job as my assistant in the circus? Come in, Jenny." She stepped into his wagon and looked about, and was so entranced by what she saw that she was only dimly aware of the door swinging shut and the lock clicking behind her. The room was filled with strange things. A bat bobbing in a large jar of alcohol. Pictures of strange creatures with 5 legs and 6 eyes. On the walls, strangely colored charts of the sun and the stars. The windows draped with a thick purple gauze. A mummified cat baring its teeth. And huddled on an old bent chair in one corner was a young girl of about her own age. "I was just talking to Esmeralda here," said the magician. "She's been a bad girl, haven't you, my pet?" "I won't stay here any longer," said the girl in a tearful voice. "That's one," said the magician, his mouth twitching a bit more than usual. "I won't be your assistant any longer," said Esmeralda. "That's 2," twitched the magician as he took a step toward the girl. Jenny whispered, "What are you going to do?" The magician turned his large eyes on her and said, "I'll be with you in a moment, my dear." Esmeralda ran to the door, but it was locked. "Let me go!" she screamed. The magician waved a long, bony finger at the girl and said, "That's 3!" With that, there was a blinding flash. Jenny looked, and there, where a moment before stood a pretty young girl, was a squeaking white mouse. The magician pounced on the mouse and chuckled. He picked it up and walked to a small closet. He opened the door and took out a cage that was filled with white mice. He dropped Esmeralda in the cage and put it away. He turned and moved toward Jenny. "And now, my dear, what was it you were saying?" he said. Jenny ran to the door and started to hammer at it with her fists. She turned and said, "You terrible, horrible man doing such an awful thing. I wouldn't be your assistant if you were the last magician on earth." The magician shook his finger at her, smiled, and said quietly, "That's 1."
Well, the water is well up over my ankles, but I managed to find an old set of hip boots. At least the rugs and floors here will get a good washing down. Now here's a story called Johnny Takes a Dare, or The More the Merrier.
The best thing about the new house they were building down by the woods at the other end of town was that there wasn't any watchman. You know how cool it is to play in a house that's being built? All that sand and all those wooden beams over the cellar that you can walk tightrope on. The kind of playing that it's a good thing parents don't know anything about, because if they did, they'd have a fit. Well, it all happened on a Saturday in the summertime, the time of year when you have dinner and still have a few hours of daylight left to play in. Johnny, a husky 10-year-old, and his pals were playing King of the Hill on the sand pile by the new home, and Johnny was doing a pretty good job of being the king. As they wrestled up and down, the sun slowly set through the trees and cast long, shadowy fingers across the unfinished house and the great piles of unused lumber. The darker it got, the brighter glowed the red warning lantern which the workmen had left behind, until finally everything was bathed in an eerie red glow. Finally, the game stopped, and the boys, breathing heavily, looked about them. "Gee, it's scary, isn't it?" one of the boys said with wide eyes. "Nothing to be scared of," said Johnny, who liked to think that he wasn't scared of anything. One of the boys whispered, "Gee, fellas, think I'll just head on home." "Oh, yeah," whispered another boy. "I'll bet that you get out of here as fast as we do." Johnny yawned and stretched. "I don't know, fellas. Maybe I'll just spend the night here," the whispering boy said. "Go on. I just dare you to." "What'll you give me if I do?" said Johnny, who liked to take dares to show how brave he was. "My new scout knife," whispered the boy as he edged toward the road home. "Sure," said Johnny, "like taking candy from a baby. Drop off and tell my folks I'm camping out for the night." Johnny looked around and started for the unfinished house. He was startled for a moment as he saw a great shadow moving against the side of it, but laughed weakly to himself as he realized it was his own shadow caused by the red lantern light. One room was almost finished. At least it had a floor and a roof on. "Good a place as any," said Johnny to himself as he found a clear place on the floor and settled down. The wind blew crisply through the open doors and windows. There was just a sliver of a moon, but it was quickly covered by a swift-moving cloud. Soon there was no light at all, but the red lantern glowed against the opposite wall. After a while, Johnny thought his eyes were playing tricks on him, because the red lantern light seemed to be getting dimmer and dimmer. What was that? He heard the sound of scratching from the next room. It got louder and louder. Then around the corner scurried a squirrel. "Phew," said Johnny half to himself. The squirrel looked at Johnny and almost grinned. At least Johnny thought he did. And he settled back again. What was that? Scratching again. Louder this time. Then he saw a shadow move slowly into the doorway. It was another squirrel, but it was as big as a cat. Johnny pretended to be asleep. The big squirrel pattered over to the little squirrel and spoke to him. "Hello there, Henry. Well, what are we going to do with him?"
"Good evening, Clarence. We'll wait until Charlie comes,"
said the little squirrel. And they both turned and grinned in Johnny's direction. Through half-closed eyes, Johnny thought that their teeth were awfully long and that he didn't care so much about that new scout knife. A few moments later, there was some more scratching. Pretty loud this time, and in the door came a squirrel as big as a sheepdog. He shuffled over to the others and nodded in greeting. Henry? Clarence? What'll we do with him?" Henry piped up.
"Like I just told Clarence here, George. I'll wait till Charlie comes."
George nodded and grinned at Johnny, who was beginning to have some doubts about this whole adventure. He was beginning to wish he was home in his own bed when he heard a heavy noise. And in through the door came a squirrel as big as a good-sized pony. His bushy tail brushed the top of the door as he entered. He lumbered over to the other three and sat up, and his head almost touched the ceiling. He said, "Hello, Clarence, George.
Oh, I didn't see you there, Henry. Well, what are we going to do with him?
The other three said,
Hello, Cecil. Wait till Charlie comes.
Then they all turned toward Johnny. But before they could grin at him, Johnny leaped to his feet, and as he ran wildly out the door, he shouted, Tell Charlie I couldn't wait!
I managed to find the most marvelous chair. It floats beautifully. And you really mustn't worry a bit about all this. We English are a seafaring people, you know. I just must be careful not to tip over, which reminds me it's time for you to tip over this record. I've been thinking the past few minutes. It's interesting to note how being afloat makes one thoughtful. The soothing motion, I suppose. At any rate, I was thinking that perhaps it might not be a good idea for you to listen to too many ghost stories. For instance, this is the sort of thing that could possibly happen.
Mr. Nuttall was a very nervous man. He had been undergoing treatment for several years now, and as he had an independent income and no need to work, he spent a great deal of his time in visits to friends and relatives. Before his nervous condition had come about, he had been an almost total recluse, spending a great deal of time raising mushrooms in his damp cellar and reading a large number of books. As a consequence, his visits to see relations consisted of meeting a large group of comparative strangers. It was in the early fall of the year when he knocked on the door of the Sappleton residence. He was ushered in by a very dignified 10-year-old girl who asked him to have a seat and told him that her aunt would be down shortly. She sat for a moment glancing at a large, strangely bound book, then looked up at Mr. Nuttall. Do you know many of the people around here? She asked. Hardly a soul, said Mr. Nuttall. Then you know practically nothing about my aunt, said the girl. Mr. Nuttall admitted he knew only her name and address. The young girl smiled sympathetically. Her great tragedy happened just 3 years ago. Tragedy? Inquired the nervous Mr. Nuttall. The girl pointed to the French windows leading to the lawn. You may wonder why we keep that window open in the fall of the year. Oh, it is quite warm for this time of the year, said Mr. Nuttall, shifting in his chair. But has that window got anything to do with the tragedy? The girl then told him this story. Out through that window 3 years ago this very day, her husband and her 2 younger brothers went off for a day's hunting in the woods, you can see there. They never came back. In crossing the swamps to their favorite piece of hunting ground, all of them were engulfed in a treacherous piece of quicksand. Their bodies were never recovered. That was the dreadful part of it. My poor aunt thinks they will all come back someday, they and the little brown dog that was lost with them, and walk in that window just as they used to do. That is why the window is kept open every evening till night falls. Poor dear aunt, she has often told me how they went out, her husband with his white raincoat over his arm, and Ronnie, her youngest brother, singing, as he always did to tease her because she said it got on her nerves. Do you know that sometimes on still, quiet evenings like this, I almost get the creepy feeling that they will all walk in through that window. Mr. Nuttall shuddered and was relieved when the aunt bustled into the room with a whirl of apologies for being late in making her appearance. I hope Vera has been amusing you, she said. She's been very interesting, said Mr. Nuttall, glancing in the direction of the open window. The long shadows of the late afternoon made the distant trees even gloomier, he thought. I do hope you don't mind the open window, said the aunt in a brisk voice. My husband and brothers will be home shortly from hunting, and They always come in this way. They've been out in the marshland today, so they'll make a fine mess on my poor carpets. So like you men folks, isn't it? She prattled on cheerfully about the hunting and the scarcity of birds and the prospects for duck in the winter. To Mr. Nuttall, it was all purely horrible. He made a desperate but not too successful attempt to turn the talk to a less ghastly topic, but he was conscious that his hostess was not giving him a great deal of her attention. Her eyes were constantly straying past him to the open window. He thought it was an unfortunate coincidence that he should have paid his visit on this tragic anniversary. He cleared his throat nervously and tried once more to capture the attention of his hostess. The doctors agree in ordering me complete rest, an absence of mental excitement, and the avoidance of anything in the way of physical exercise. On the matter of diet, they are not so much in agreement. No, said the aunt. Then she suddenly brightened into alert attention. Here they are at last, and just in time for tea. Don't they look as if they're muddy up to the eyes? Mr. Nuttall shivered slightly and turned toward the little girl to give her a smile of sympathy. The child was staring out through the open window with dazed horror in her eyes. In the chill shock of nameless fear, Mr. Nuttall swung around and looked in the same direction. In the deepening twilight, 3 figures were walking across the lawn toward the window. They all carried guns under their arms, and one of them carried a muddy white raincoat. A tired brown spaniel was close at their heels. Noiselessly they neared the house, and then Mr. Nuttall heard...
Do you ken John Peel in his coat of grey? Do you ken John Peel at the break of day with the fox and the hounds in the morning?
Good heavens! Just as the little girl had said, one of the men was singing. Mr. Nuttall grabbed wildly for his hat and coat and dove for the front door. Flinging it open, he ran down the path, tried to jump the hedges, tripped and fell down. He picked himself up and with one terrified look back at the house, ran down the road toward the railroad station. Back in the house, the figure carrying the muddy white raincoat stepped in the open window and said, "Well, we're home, dear. A bit muddy, but on time for supper." "Who was that ran out as we came up to the house?" That was a Mr. Nuttall, dear," said the aunt. "Some distant relative who dropped in for a visit." "Extraordinary man. All he seemed to talk about was his illness, and when he saw you coming, dashed off without saying a word. I don't know what to make of it." The little girl shook her head gravely and said, "I expect it was the spaniel. Mr. Nuttall has a horror of dogs. He was telling me just before you came down that once he was chased into a cemetery by a pack of wild dogs and had to spend the night in a newly dug grave with the creatures snarling and grinning and foaming just above him." "Oh, why, the poor man," said her aunt. "One would have thought he had seen a ghost." The little girl smiled sweetly.
I'm listing rather heavily to the starboard side, and unless I can paddle my way to the kitchen and find some high ground, I may not be with you much longer. Well, at any rate, whilst I attempt this intricate naval maneuver, here's a story about a man named Sam Preston, which I refer to as the helpful hitchhiker.
You probably never heard of Sam Preston. I didn't till one rainy night in spring a couple of years back. I was barreling along Highway 6 into the foothills of the Rockies in a 30-ton diesel carrying about 20 tons of high-octane gasoline. It was pretty windy, too, as I recall. But even though the visibility was not so good, I had to make time on account of that flat I had outside Omaha. Almost midnight, and I wanted to get to a diner and get some coffee because I needed it pretty bad. I was having trouble staying awake. I've been doing these long hauls for about 15 years now, but I never made this route. Anyway, I'm doing about 50 and staring at the white line in the highway, and Rain is splashing off the windshield, and the wipers are going lickety-split. And then I saw him. Now, I'm not one to pick up hitchhikers. You never know. Might be a hijacker. Besides, we got orders not to. I got a glimpse of him as I went by, and what the devil, here's an old guy out in a storm and no raincoat, and it's a good 10 miles to anywhere. So I hit the brakes hard, and I could feel all that gasoline sloshing around in the big tank, piling up the weight behind me. But I pumped the brakes till I stopped and then waited for him to catch up. Boy, was he soaked. He swung up into the cab and dropped into the seat. "Thanks, fella," he said. "Here," I said, and I handed him a towel that I always keep handy for washing and shaving. Before I even asked him, he tells me he was out walking and got caught in a storm. Wasn't going far, he said, but every little bit helps. Seemed like a gentle old guy, gray hair and all. Used to be a driver himself, so he knew all about trucks and long hauls. Said he stopped driving about 10 years ago, and now he had a part-time job. Didn't tell me what it was. His name was Sam Preston. Anyway, he knew the roads, and we talked some. Every so often I'd glance over at him. The lights from all the dials on the dashboard gave him a funny look, like he was sitting there in a kind of a misty glow. And his voice was like a whisper that somehow cut through the noise of the motor. Those diesels make quite a racket, you know. Oh, he asked about my kids, which was pretty strange since I didn't recall saying anything about them. Well, after a while, he told me that the place he got off was just a little ways ahead, and so I started to slow down. Just before he got out, he told me about a diner that was about 2 miles up ahead, but said to be careful because of a hairpin turn just before you come to it. The curve was not so bad, but this time of year there might be rock slides, especially with all the rain. He jumped out and thanked me, and I leaned over to the other side of the cab to thank him for the tip, but I couldn't see him. Just like that, he was gone. I didn't see any houses. So about 10 minutes later, I ran into that hairpin turn, and it was a good thing I was taking it easy, because there in the road ahead was a great big rock slide, just like Sam said there might be. I left the lights on, and I jumped out. The truck couldn't get by, and I'd have to call the main office. I crawled over the big boulders, and I saw the lights of the diner. Just then, a state trooper car drove up and told me they'd have a bulldozer there in a couple of hours, and I could get through then. So I went over to the diner. I made the call, and the dispatcher was pretty nasty. I was pretty nasty back, too, because all I could think of was 20 tons of gasoline exploding and me in the middle of it. Nothing to do now but wait. I sat down for some coffee and told the guy behind the counter all about it. I told him that if it hadn't been for Sam Preston hitchhiking, I might look something like those hamburgers he was frying up. The counterman dropped a fork, and he looked at me. "Who?" he said. "Sam Preston," I said. "Lives around here someplace. Maybe you know him. Used to be a truck driver." "Yeah, that's right," said the counterman. Sam Preston was a truck driver. About 10 years ago, he was caught in a rock slide out there about where your truck is standing. He was killed.
My chair sank. I'm addressing you from the top of the refrigerator. Never at a loss, however, I managed to salvage my small radio transmitter as I floated past the closet. And while the water is creeping up over my knees, I am attempting to attract some nearby plumber. Well, there go the batteries. Nothing to do now but wait. The last few minutes are the hardest, you know. They always have been, for me at any rate. If I'd only thought to bring the vanishing cream. Which brings us to a story about a boy named Jimmy.
Jimmy knew all about the haunted house. He knew that it belonged to his Aunt Mary, but she would never talk about it. She said the stories about the house were silly nonsense and that there were no such things as ghosts. If all the villagers weren't a lot of superstitious idiots, she would be able to rent the house, and then she would have enough money to buy Jimmy some decent clothes, and best of all, take him to the movies as often as he would like to go. Jimmy thought about the house a lot. if he could only prove there wasn't any ghost. And so one Saturday morning, when his aunt was in the village, Jimmy took the key to the haunted house and started out. Nothing to be scared of, he told himself. Ghosts aren't around in the daytime. But when he pushed through the dark, gloomy path and looked at those blank, dusty windows, he wasn't so sure. He walked up to the porch and stopped. His feet didn't seem to want to go up the steps. It took him nearly 5 minutes to persuade them to move, but they finally did. They marched him right up to the door, and Jimmy put the key in the keyhole. It turned with a squeak, and Jimmy pushed the door open and went in. The hall was empty. And then, as he stood there, listening to the bumping of his heart, gradually the light faded. The hall grew darker and darker, as if something huge had come up the porch behind him and stood there blocking the doorway. Then the door, all by itself, began to swing shut. And before he could stop it, it closed. And it was while he was pulling frantically at the handle to get out that Jimmy saw the ghost. It was a tall, dim, white figure, and it came gliding slowly down the stairs towards him. Jimmy gave a yell and yanked open the door and tore down the steps. He didn't stop until he was well down the road. Then he had to catch his breath. He sat down on a log. Boy, he thought, I've seen a ghost. Golly, that was awful. Then after a minute he thought, what was so awful about it? He was trying to scare me like some smart aleck who's always jumping out from behind things. Pretty silly thing for a grown-up ghost to be doing. You know, it always makes you mad when someone deliberately tries to scare you. And as Jimmy got over his fright, he began to get angry. And pretty soon he got up and started back. He thought at least he would get the key which he'd left in the door. This time he approached very quietly, and as he reached out cautiously for the key, he heard a faint sound. He peeked in, and there was the ghost. He was going back upstairs, but he wasn't gliding now. He was doing sort of a dance, and every other step he would double over and shake with laughter. He was enjoying the joke he had played on the boy. Well, this made Jimmy madder than ever. He stuck his head into the hallway and yelled at the top of his lungs. Boo! The ghost gave a shriek, leaped 2 feet in the air, and then collapsed on the stairs. Well, as soon as Jimmy saw he could scare the ghost even worse than the ghost could scare him, he wasn't afraid anymore, and he came right into the hall. The ghost was hanging on the banister and panting. He looked at Jimmy and moaned, "Oh, for goodness sake, boy. Heavens to bedsheets, what an awful thing to do." Jimmy smiled at him. "Now we're even." The ghost looked pained and said, "Look-a-here, Sonny, you don't understand. Ghosts are supposed to scare people. People aren't supposed to scare ghosts. It could be pretty serious for me if people got to know about it." Jimmy said, "You mean you don't want me to tell anybody about it?" "Suppose we make a deal," the ghost said. "You keep still about this, and in return well, let's see, how would you like to know how to vanish?" "Oh, but that'd be swell," Jimmy exclaimed. "But can you vanish?" "Sure," said the ghost. And he did. But his voice went right on explaining how handy it would be to get into the movies free, and if anybody wanted Jimmy to do some chores, they wouldn't be able to find him. But Jimmy had been thinking about things, and he said no, that there was only one thing that would keep him from telling people how easy it was to scare ghosts, and that was for the ghost to move into the old Miller house up the road. "That old shack," said the ghost. "Have a heart, boy. The doors are half off. Roof leaky, rain dripping all over the place." So they argued about it. The ghost said if Jimmy wanted to make money, he could learn to vanish, then he could join a circus and get a big salary. Jimmy said he didn't want to be in a circus. He wanted to go to college and learn to be a doctor. So the ghost sobbed and cried and said he'd been living in the house for 30 years and now he was being thrown out into the cold world. Well, he was trying to make Jimmy feel cruel. But Jimmy didn't feel cruel at all and pointed out that the ghost had certainly driven plenty of other people out into the cold world. And at last they came to an agreement. The ghost agreed to try out the old Miller house and teach Jimmy to vanish, in return for which Jimmy promised not to tell anyone that ghosts could be scared. So Jimmy's aunt cleaned up the house and rented it to some nice people and bought Jimmy some new clothes and took him to the movies. But every Saturday morning, Jimmy went up to the old Miller house for his vanishing lessons. It is really quite easy when you know how. And after only a few weeks, he could flicker. And in 6 weeks, the ghost gave him an examination, and he got B+, which is very good for a human. He taught Jimmy several more tricks. The best one was how to glare with fiery eyes, which was useful later on when Jimmy became a doctor and had to look down people's throats. So if ever you are in the hospital and hear a voice over the loudspeaker calling,
Dr. Jim Crandall, call for Dr. Crandall,
it might well be that it's Jimmy they're looking for, because every now and then he forgets himself and just vanishes.
It's a good thing to know if ever you are staring into the darkness and you see something staring back, simply say, boo, and it will go away. In the time we have left, I might mention several other interesting things. Don't ever brag about what you do if you saw a ghost. It's a sure way to get them angry at you. Don't slam doors, as you might pinch a ghost. Don't leave sharp objects like knives lying around. A ghost might sit on them. Just keep convincing yourself you aren't frightened, that you are brave, that there is nothing that can scare you. I really can't go on much longer. There's only about 3 inches of airspace between the water and the ceiling. If you will be good enough to stop this record now, before the water can rise, I shall be more than grateful. Hurry, please hurry.